The most insulting thing is to reduce the Torah to the concept of wortlach, which means cute, safe, trivial pieces of chewing gum for the mind. The Torah is not wortlach. The Torah is grandeur. The Torah is neurosurgery. Showing the Torah off as a little cool thing is pathetic. The Torah is not a cool little thing. It's the thing. It's not even a website, it's the operating system.
Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt is a rabbi, teacher, lecturer, and counselor. He served for more than 30 years as the senior rabbi of the Riverdale Jewish Center in the Bronx, New York. Rabbi Rosenblatt comes from an illustrious line of rabbinic figures. His grandfather, Rabbi Samuel Rosenblatt, was founding rabbi of the Beth Tefiloh congregation in Baltimore, Maryland. And Rabbi Rosenblatt is the great-grandson of celebrated cantor Reb Yossele Rosenblatt, who taught him the importance of developing a range in his repertoire.
I would say he shaped my tools. You needed range. You needed to be able to whisper, and you needed to be able to shout.
In this masterclass episode of the Maggid Method, we discuss everything sermon-related, including how to maximize your effectiveness as a rabbi through the Drasha and the bedside.
The great rabbis, the rabbis who, when they're in the pulpit, people feel that they're speaking to them directly because they realize that the rabbi really does know them. And on the other side, when the rabbi walks into their hospital room, it's as if someone has walked out of the world of media, someone just ever so slightly larger than life.
How to develop an intuition for identifying great Drasha material.
And I don't know why I know this, but I feel the heat radiating from my Midrash Tanchum. On that line, I can feel heat.
The need for a rabbi to self-validate instead of looking for external approval.
I think rabbis who read the polls, who want to know every week, did they like it? The craftsman has to please himself.
And the erroneous notion that any one drasha needs to change lives.
There shouldn't be one sermon which says your message. There should be, several thousand iterations of your basic principles, of your vision. And the kids who grow up listening to you absorb it. They don't just get it with a single injection.
I learned so much from my interview with Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt, and I'm sure you will too. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt.
Good morning.
Hi, Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
Thank you. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
I think you're welcome, but let's see how it goes. The great formative early personality in my life was my grandfather, blessed memory, who was a great preacher, published, in addition to his scholarly work, several books of sermons, which now seem a little bit dated. But in his generation, he was one of the great preachers. And I grew up listening to him. Learned a lot from him about diction, about presence. I wouldn't say that the way I preach is copies him or even descends from him, except in a rather distant way. But he taught me to take the genre very seriously. I was always listening to preachers. I never had in mind that there was one model, but I would go to places, and as opposed to perhaps the Lithuanian tradition of bittul, where if you see anyone good, the first thing you want to do is find his clay feet and pull out your hatchet. I was interested in people who had been in their pulpits for many years and had held a congregation, held the pulpit, and asking myself, what is it that they're doing? What are the elements that make people want to keep listening to this person. Well, there are rabbis who I would call anti-sermonic rabbis, where their sermons were tolerated because their other capacities were so extraordinary. I once went to hear a rabbi who will go nameless, several generations back, in a large synagogue. And I was astounded. The whole room just talked through his sermon. And he tolerated that. And yet, this is a person who was in the same shul for over 40 years. And I'm trying to remember if I did or didn't go to his funeral. But I remember at his passing, the people spoke of him with such love and veneration. And it was clearly that this was an anti-sermonic career, where the sermon just was not one of the ingredients that made him great.
Would you say it's anti-sermonic or asermonic? Meaning it was irrelevant.
I guess asermonic, except he gave a sermon every week and they hated it. And yet, no one would ever have thought to dismiss him. I know rabbis who were superstars in the pulpit and who lost their congregations. Because I think the pulpit alone is never sufficient. The days of Billy Sunday rabbis, where everyone comes for a lightning show, and then forgets everything to do. Those days are over. The great rabbis are the ones who maintain a kind of a dialectical tension between the pulpit and the bedside. The rabbis who, when they're in the pulpit, people feel that they're speaking to them directly because they realize that the rabbi really does know them. And on the other side, when the rabbi walks into their hospital room, it's as if someone has walked out of the world of media, someone just ever so slightly larger than life and actually cares about them. So in what I would consider great long-term community rabbinate positions, there is that dialectical tension. In any case, during my years of peregrination, I heard some of the great preachers. I mean, I heard Dr. Lamb, Zichrono Livracha. I heard Dr. Riskin, Rabbi Riskin. Some were only briefly on the American scene and didn't make a huge impression here. Somebody like Rabbi Isaac Bernstein, Zichrono Livracha, who was in the Jewish Center in Manhattan and then returned to England. Rabbi Joseph Grunblatt of Queens Jewish Center was a very, very serious, highly professional rabbi in the highest sense of that, in the calling sense of that, and a marvelous preacher, and someone who managed to do what very few rabbis do, and that is to be in the same pulpit for decades and decades and not to lose his edge, never to take his craft for granted, never to stop preparing, never to become to let his burnout show in public. And he was a rabbi's rabbi, not spoken about enough because he didn't spend his time publishing or working on a brand. He actually did the work, for 40 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are others I can mention. And then there are two other levels. There are other, great preachers who just in terms of the craft are always interesting to listen to. I mean, obviously everyone, you can hardly speak in America and not listen to Martin Luther King, for example. And there were others, several great professors who I thought had secrets to offer. And then moving and jumping another electron ring, so to speak. there are people doing other things that have, I think, nourishment for someone who's trying to understand what it is to be a great preacher. I think what you find in the highest levels of any given craft, in order to look for new horizons of excellence, people actually have to go. They have to go to other artistic endeavors, even other professional endeavors, to reimagine what they do in higher terms, as opposed to just looking around at what other people are doing and deciding, this one makes me jealous and this one makes me contemptuous. Well, that's a false coin. That both sides of that coin are counterfeit. It doesn't help to be jealous, and it doesn't help to be contemptuous. Because it's interesting, even among what I would consider mediocre preachers, people that I might not want to hear every day, if you ask yourself, like, what is this person's best? What does he do when he's doing his best? Now you have to say his best or her best. You can also identify, you begin to see the phenomenon of the one-string banjo, of someone whose style suffers perhaps from an early success, which they continue to repeat, instead of recognizing that you really need many strings on the instrument, and until you're talking about a full-fledged lyre where you have a lot of strings. So, having the strings is only one side of the equation, and the rabbi, any preacher, has to decide, what is he doing? What does success look like? What is he trying to accomplish in those, whatever it is, 10 to 20 minutes in the pulpit?
Right. When you say other disciplines, if I understood you correctly, do you mean, like, let's say a person will look for greatness in a musician or an artist or some just pursue greatness?
Right. It could be another art. It could even be a craft or a science. I mean, we had a very famous pediatrician in our congregation, and I would always say, I want to be a rabbi the way Donald Gribbetts is a doc. May he rest in peace. That to me was what excellence was. In his particular case, what I was thinking of was the capacity to be excellent in the granular and in the broad, in the broad spectrum. That he was an encyclopedia of knowledge. And yet, when a child would come to him with the simplest common textbook sniffle, you had 100% of him. That was remarkable. And I think that sensitivity to the granular actually informed his broad perspective about the practice of medicine. And he drew from that.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about your grandfather, was this on your mother's side or your father's side?
My father's side.
Father's side. And I read that you are descended from the great Chazan, Reb Yossele Rosenblatt.
That's my grandfather's father. Mm-hmm.
Did that influence? And obviously, you didn't see him, but did it influence your? I guess maybe your thought of yourself as carrying on, his legacy in a certain way.
I don't think of it in those terms. However, I would say that since I was listening to him since I was very, very young, and personality-wise, he's very different from my grandfather. He was a source of something deeper than inspiration. I would say he shaped my tools in terms of the way I understood, for example, the interplay between deep pathos and playfulness. The fact that each of those had a place, the rabbinic keyboard, so to speak,
The range.
You needed range. You needed to be able to whisper, and you needed to be able to shout. You needed to be able to cry, and you needed to be able to shift gears into humor. And so his use of his range, which was remarkable, because although he drew from many, many different musical traditions, from the most traditional to whatever he was being exposed to, the opera, I would even argue occasionally jazz, although I haven't documented that. It was never at the expense of his mission. Like, what is it that we are here to do? And the openness to discovering new tools, new points of entry, the openness to the reality of an evolving audience, and yet holding the center, always holding the object in clear view, is one of the great features of his career, and also the source of his longevity in terms of continuing to fascinate, continuing to be relevant. I think that there is usually nothing older than an aged sermon. Sermons age about 10 minutes behind the newspaper, unless they're really, really good. The sermons that you can still read 50 and 60 years later are remarkable. And it's amazing the ones that don't make the cut. Don't mean it to be in no way disrespectful. One Yom Tov, I was discussing sermons with my wife's grandfather, who was Rabbi Soloveitchik. And he referred me to the writings of his uncle, who had been the Shtat Maggid in Vilna. And he claimed that his uncle was his inspiration, who taught him the craft of drush. Everyone who's read anything of Rav Soloveitchik knows that beyond the categories of most of the greatest gedolim, his capacity as a darshan was unparalleled. And so I ran and I got a hold of this out of print book, and I read the drashas.
Were they in Hebrew?
They were in Hebrew.
Hebrew. Uh-huh.
Hebrew. And honestly, it was very, very fine, very refined drush, but also terribly, terribly, bleakly bound to its particular moment in history. They were not drushas that you could transpose. They didn't have that quality of having struck an eternal chord. So, and that's going to be true of many of the drushas, which in their own moment are hailed as being great. The very things which make them great, namely the fact that they are so in sync with a contemporary ethos, are going to be the things that make them forgotten by history. Much harder to get a place on the shelf of eternal drushas than to get on the shelf of eternal shilas and shuvas. You have to be a golden soil to write a great shuva. But if you write a great shuva, the Chassam Sofer and Reb Moshe Feinstein will move over and make room for you. But if you write a great drasha, not so easy. And the shelf's not that crowded.
What are the elements that make something stand the test of time?
I think that, first of all, something that reimagines a text so that the kind of text that will always be relevant. A great drasha. I always tell there are only two drashas. There's the drasha where you take the obscure and make it familiar, and the drasha where you take the familiar and make it luminous. Right? So there's certain Rashis. Everybody knows those Rashis. There are certain psukim that are very familiar. If you can make people see them as if they've never seen them before, that could be an extraordinary drasha. On the other side, there are certain areas of Jewish learning that are considered in the popular imagination so arcane that you have to fight a default shutdown of the system when you even introduce them as an idea. And yet, if you can teach the people not to blink, if you can break the default reaction and bring them inside, some of those areas hold the most extraordinary enlightenment, the most power. So if you're starting with a very strong textual illumination in either of those categories, your drasha has a chance of lasting. When it comes to the application, sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with giving a sermon that is not going to be immortal. You're not, for the most part, you're not playing that game. You're helping people get through to the next Shabbos. So to strike the right note on the Shabbos following 9/11, on the Shabbos following October 7th, you can't talk about something else. You must address that which has just captivated, in a heartbreaking sense, the imagination of your community. You have to address it. Now, if you can avoid saying something which is trite, then you're on a good path. But don't expect that necessarily to be, on an occasion, someone responds in a remarkably insightful way, and that becomes the sermon of 9/11. That becomes the sermon which captured the moment and yet also encapsulated it. But that's, those are few and far between. A Shabbos when your community is suddenly thrust into deep sorrow, lo aleinu v'lo aleichem, the death of a young person unexpectedly, the death of an elder of the community who everyone loved. There are times when you need to crawl into the emotions and the morass of the moment and be there and show that the Torah, Imo Anochi B'Tzora, is something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expresses through the Torah itself, that he, through the words of the Torah, he enters our predicaments. But the real, to me, interesting, challenging sermons are the ones, on a sleepy, short Shabbos in November, where there's no bar mitzvah, no ufruf. It's an undistracted, generic Shabbos, that rarest of delicate creatures. And you can say something, bring something to light or to life that sends people home. I actually would prefer to be a sermon that stirs something than just one that says, wow, that was nice, that was beautiful. Those are terminal reactions. If someone says to you that, you captured our Shabbos table, and we were practically throwing food at each other in anger because of the issues you raised, and we all wanted to know, what did you mean by that? I love that. That's nice too. But to a certain extent, you also have to be able to please yourself. I think rabbis who read the polls, who want to know every week, did they like it? That's not the way you practice as a craftsman. A craftsman has to please himself. A craftsman has to have a vision of that perfect platonic drasha that could be the biggest crowd pleaser in the world. And he's the one who knows what was wrong with it. In my opinion, at the highest level, you have to always be in search of all that perfection, or that quality. And sometimes you almost feel like you're in critical dialogue with Rabbi Shalom himself. The people loved it. Does that mean that I sold you out? I think a lot of rabbis make the mistake of thinking that the success of a drasha is, did people go home and change their lives? I think that's maybe a good test for a commercial on the Super Bowl at halftime. Did they go out and buy the product? Terrible yardstick of a sermon. Maybe a good yardstick if you're a scholar in residence and you only get to ring the bell once. But for a rabbi in a pulpit is transmitting fundamental concepts and an ethos by a process almost as slow as osmosis. There shouldn't be one sermon which says your message. There should be, 1,000, several thousand iterations of your basic principles, of your vision. And the kids who grow up listening to you absorb it. They don't just get it with a single injection.
Do you think it's possible? I guess it's possible, but do you think it's common to achieve that over so many years now, when the pace of life has accelerated so quickly and people becoming more transient, people are moving from place to place? Do you have that platform where you can administer that steady drip over time to change over the course of decades? Is that common anymore in the rabbinate?
No, but it was never common, because most rabbinic lives are lived on a treadmill. And after years and years and years of both training and counseling rabbis, well, if I had to diagnose one endemic challenge, it's time management. So, as often as not, the sermon takes a backseat to the many other urgent things that rabbis do. I think the rabbinate has become even more of that, but I won't bore you with my more, pandemic thoughts about the rabbinate and the community. But in a certain way, it may be difficult to do that locally, just preaching to your congregation. But I think that there are rabbis around the country who have attracted followings of people who access them on the internet, and they do have a sustained audience over long periods of time. It's not quite the same as the magic of Shabbos morning in shul. It's not quite the magic of coming to shul in a blizzard. when, 30% of the people are there and the rabbi gives one of the best drashas of his life, and they walk out feeling just privileged to have been one of the people in that echoing emptiness who were actually there to catch it. And those are not sad Shabbos mornings for the rabbi, when the audience was, had the fragrance of a brilliant reduction at the hands of a master chef. It was a reduction. I spoke to the people who deserved to hear it. There's something intimate about that, which is exhilarating. One of those, the rabbinate has a great deal of difficulty discovering sources for its own aerobic energy production, to discover the kinds of things that simply can power your battery to do it for another week, not to mention for another year or another decade. And learning how to discover those sources of aerobic reinvigoration. That's a really important piece of the rabbi's inner world, his inner game. And I think, the ongoing offer of a creative enterprise, of a new palette every week, I think that if a rabbi really has aspirations, and not aspirations for applause and not aspirations for promotion, but aspirations for greatness in terms that he can only visualize vaguely in the future. That's an amazing thing. It's also, I won't lie, it can be a source of some of the most crushing disappointment. To the walk home after a sermon you hated, a horrible experience. You just want the ground to swallow you. You question your very right to take your next breath. Like, ugh. And yet, there's next week. You don't have to get on the horse. The horse is going to get under you.
Hey there, fellow podcast listeners. Are you enjoying the show so far? I hope you're finding value in all the insightful conversations coming your way, and I'm grateful for all the time we get to spend together. Now, I have a small favor to ask, one that can make a big difference. Your feedback is invaluable to me. By taking a moment to rate and review this podcast, you're not only showing your support, but also helping it reach new heights. Picture this: more reviews means more visibility. More visibility means more incredible guests lining up to share their stories and expertise with you. So, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, how about making some magic happen? Scroll down, tap that rating, jot down a few words. It's that simple. Your action today can pave the way for even greater experiences tomorrow. Thanks for your support. Now let's get back to the program.
So when I asked you for if you had any sermons written or recorded, you said that you typically do not write them or do not record them. So I'm curious about your process. Do you commit to memory what you're going to say? Do you have bullet points? Do you how does the process look like?
Well, let me tell you. Let me just reveal a bit of pathetic personal history here. I have a condition called amblyopia, aka lazy eye. Very interesting. It's something that's been diagnosed forever and ever and ever. They knew I had it when I was a little kid, and I've asked world rank ophthalmologists whether they've really done anything. They don't really know what to do. Bottom line is, I have terrible trouble focusing on print. If I were to attempt to read a sermon, I have over 50 years of my grandfather's sermons written out longhand. And I'm hoping once we get settled in our new home, I will have a chance to turn my attention to them, because it has to be the most remarkable trove of rabbinic sermonics in that period. It goes from the late 1920s to the early 1970s. You got it all in there. Anyway, and my grandfather wrote his sermons out, and you would never know it when you heard him speak. I tried that in my early sermons, by which I mean when I was 14, 15, 16. And even in my early efforts, my first high holiday engagements. By the way, matter of personal animus, I hate it when people talk about rabbinic work as a gig. I'm just putting that out there. I don't know why, it just nauseates me. Anyway, you can cut that out if you think. At any rate, it never worked for me. And the reason it didn't was because if I look down even to notes, the worst is if I try to find something in a sefer, no matter how I highlight it. Until my eyes focus and I find what I'm looking for, my pace is broken. And so, not as a matter of craft, but as a matter of survival, I learned to speak from my head, which doesn't mean I memorize the language. Sometimes they used to say that Flaubert, when he was writing Madame Bovary, he would say that he heard phrases pages and pages ahead. He didn't know what he was writing, but he heard the phrases. Sometimes that will happen. But more often than not, I just speak. Now, that's not to say that I don't have a shape and an outline, but interesting, the way in which sermons rest in my mind before I give them, it's going to be a combination of sounds and pictures. In other words, I will hear the music of certain phrases, but I will also see. I will see a picture. And when I'm speaking, I'm describing the picture as if it were before my eyes. I've always told every one of the young guys whom I've trained over the years, and there are scores and scores of them, I always tell them, do not try to imitate my method. I can teach you what a good sermon should sound like. I can help you think about the components, but don't try to do what I do, because mine is, it's a kind of a neuroplastic adjustment to an anomaly, to a pathology, actually. So my method, I'm telling you that merely as a matter of interest, but if this podcast is supposed to help people who are going to preach, please don't try this at home, boys and girls, because you'll get clobbered.
Yeah. So how would you advise a person to go about, is it, Chana Chanar Lefi Darko, whatever a person is drawn to, or his strength is, or do you feel that there is an ideal process to it?
Well, I'm not married to the idea of an ideal process. Neither am I married to the ideal of a classical shape of a sermon. Rabbi Lookstein Shalita, whom I adore, Rabbi Lookstein, when he teaches homiletics, teaches a very rigorous, based on the number 3, which has its sources in classical rhetorical shapes and sizes. I'm not quite that rigid, but some of the pre-work is where I think great Drashas work on. First of all, good drush comes out of good learning. And that rather than look for a chazal that I want to darshan, I would encourage someone to say, well, let's assume I want to take my message from the Torah or from the Haftorah or something. Narrow the focus, take a subject, take a section, take an aliyah, or whatever you need, and learn it well. Don't think about darshaning. Learn it well. Learn many mefarshim. See what is troubling them. What creativity they bring to bear there. That's one piece. And great learning can take place on many, many different levels. There are rabbis whose learning is most effective when it's shaped by halakhic questions. There are rabbis who are more midrashic, I would say, / narrative oriented. It almost doesn't matter. Do good learning, and somewhere there will be a drasha. Doesn't matter whether, what color the cow was that you milked. If you do it well, if you fill a bucket, there will be cream. The second is a kind of an intuition, which some people don't have and some people do. And that's what I call the concept of the warm spot. That when you're learning a turn of phrase in a Rashi, an image in a Sforno, an association with a midrashic tradition, you say you just get this feeling. It's like goosebumps or something sometimes. You just say to yourself, gosh, I don't know what that means. And I don't know why I know this. But there's greatness, there's potential in that. I feel the heat radiating from my Midrash Tanchuma. On that line, I can feel heat. Generally speaking, if you follow the heat, the ability to exfoliate it, to bring it to flower will happen. Now, you can't be rigid about your application. The other pre-work that I think is really helpful, and this is where I don't think young rabbis get rigorous training at all. I don't even think in the instruction of homiletics has not really been pedagogically revamped in a very long time. So people just stumble around. But the first question you want to ask is, what genre am I working in? Is this a fully developed sermon? Is it a Dvar Torah for a Hashkama minyan, where they want you in and out in 5 minutes? Is it a drasha relevant to a life event, to a eulogy, to a wedding, to a charge to a bar mitzvah child or a bas mitzvah? Until you know what genre you're working in, you can't possibly know what pieces you need to put it together. And many sermons suffer from over preparation or lopsidedness. So, for example, there's a very great difference between a drasha and a shir. If I'm going to give a shir on Parshas HaShavua, then, and if I've focused well, then a multivalent approach is very desirable. To say that let's read this through the lenses of 3, 5, 7 different mefarshim and see how those views compare. If I gave such a shir and there was something I sensed in there has potential as a sermon, then I want to extrude the Malbim. I want to teach the Malbim as if he is the only interpretation of a given verse. I shouldn't feel the need to summarize as I'm trying to get to the Malbim, and here's what Rashi says, and here's what the Ibn Ezra says, and here's what the Sforno says, and finally I come to the Malbim. Wrong genre, pal. You're trying to pack your Chumash shir into your sermon. Your sermon's going to have varicose veins. It's just not. You're not moving correctly. if you think what the Malbim said has that kind of light, that it shines on a broader truth. Because whether the Malbim is the most elegant or most accurate interpreter of that verse is less important than the relevance, the truth, the importance of the message that the Malbim thought he heard in that verse. Because that's what you're really after. You're after not so much application, but implication. That what the Malbim heard has vast implications. If that is true, then that fills suddenly a big cavity that you never noticed, that suddenly opens before you, and that cavity is waiting. So understanding the genre is very important.
Let me ask, I'm curious, you talk about, heat radiating off something and saying, there's something here. I'm not sure what it is yet. But how does a rabbi understand what may be fascinating or interesting to him, or exciting, or, something that he feels, he can extract from this Malbim or extend, is necessarily relevant to the people that he's speaking to? How can you be sure of that? Let's say a halachic, type of implication.
But chances are, and this is again where the 40-year process comes in, there comes a point where what you know and what you think, whether they completely identify with it or not, your people know. You basically get up there and take off your clothes every single week. There's not going to be, a sudden shock. The other danger, so you are safest if you preach to yourself, at least in the Torah sense, if what you are feeling is something you are genuinely excited about. It is easier to you to share your excitement than to take something which to you is basically tedious, prosaic, and think that you're going to dramatize it for the people because they need it. I don't think that's a healthy relationship between a rabbi and a tzibur, because it's diminishing. And what will come out in a series of such sermons is that the rabbi doesn't think very much of us. The rabbi talks down. I would rather talk over people's heads and speak about something that I'm truly thrilled about than think I am reaching them and run the risk that the rabbi's talking down to us. It's risk benefit ratios. I'm pretty convinced that anything I maybe it's because I'm not that smart, but anything that I'm excited about, I can make other people excited about it, which in many cases just realizing that they have technical barriers. A certain area in halacha or a certain midrashic tradition they don't happen to be familiar with. So I learned from the greatest of all practitioners that you can usually close that gap in 4 or 5 lines, namely Rashi. The great encyclopedia Rashis throughout Shas, where Rashi in just a few words can orient us in an area of halacha, which has come in as an example of some theoretical concept, but where we are ice cold. Rashi is the warmer upper par excellence. And so sometimes a rabbi does that.
Just bring you up to speed quickly.
Yeah. And sometimes the asides are more valuable to the people. The asides are more valuable than the point you think you're making. Because here's something a lot of people don't know. I always used to joke about, this is a famous thing. How does a rabbi define the word famous? It means I learned it yesterday. So now it's famous. For yesterday, I didn't know it either. So now I'm going to make it famous for you. It's going to be famous. It's not hard. It's not so hard to do that. If you are committed to bringing people along on your journey, if you believe in them, that anything that moves you, if you just take the time to explain it correctly, can move them as well. They will be happy to join.
And when you move them, are you moving them because something is necessarily? It sounds to me in this case it's more indirectly moving them because they're moving through your excitement, seeing what the flash of a Torah insight, how it affects you, whereas it may not necessarily be directly relevant to their lives at all.
I really don't care about that thing that the relevant in the immediacy sense. See, every drasha has two messages. One message is the Torah has something to say about this. The greater message is that the Torah plays hardball. The Torah engages the great human questions. The most insulting thing is to reduce the Torah to the concept of wortlach, which means cute, safe, trivial pieces of chewing gum for the mind. The Torah is not wortlach. The Torah is grandeur. The Torah is neurosurgery. And when the rabbi speaks, and as I say, you have to have a broad palette. But even when the rabbi doesn't speak about something that, okay, now I'm going to go home and heat my cholent differently, the rabbi speaks about much broader categories. There are times when preaching the message of the Torah's grandeur is much more important, because that message means when something really counts, we turn to Torah. And that's something which a rabbinic career, you talk about the meta messages that are not captured in a single drasha, but rather range across a whole career in the pulpit. That's one of them. But the Torah is not cute. It's not like the embarrassed techies who are trying to bring something into class which will make the normal kids engage with them. Go, hey guys, this is really a cool thing. Here's a really cool thing. Showing the Torah off as a little cool thing is pathetic. The Torah is not a cool little thing. It's the thing. It's not even a website. It's the operating system. And that opens something which we won't have time to talk about, and that is the associative quality of drush, which means that, in my opinion, great darshanim are people who are always controlling a kind of a universalistic curiosity, where when they begin to think about a truth in the Torah, are just wildly associating it with, everything from an exhibit at the Met to an experience in a supermarket. It's just the world just glitters with reflections of the truth that's in the Torah in its most articulate, accessible form. And so one of the factors that makes a great darshan is that he brings an absolutely unpredictable grist to his melon. Things that you would never expect to hear in a drasha. Not because they're, off color, or just because they seem to exist in some universe where the Torah doesn't reach. And every time you do that, you're putting another chip on the table and saying, "Wrong, buddy. Don't ever bet against the Torah. The Torah is everywhere." Which is, it's not a pantheistic kind of a thing. It doesn't mean that everything is Torah. But it means that in terms of refining our understanding of the Torah, that flash can be anywhere. Anyway, I think we're out of time.
So. Yeah, that was amazing. I almost feel like if you'd be open to it, maybe a part 2, because you have so much to share.
Well, why don't you go back and listen to it and then decide? There really wasn't anything there. I don't know what killed an hour.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. There's a secret that great public speakers know. Did you know there's a method for cutting straight through to an audience's heart, grabbing their attention and holding it, and making a memorable impact with your presentation? The best speakers in the world utilize it, and now you can too, every time you get up to speak. Download your free Maggid Method of Public Speaking template at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. The Maggid Method will teach you how to find your authentic voice, craft meaningful presentations, manage people's attention, and build unbreakable bonds with your audience. Go to maggidmethod.com and download your free copy now.
I think a lot of rabbis make the mistake of thinking that the success of a drasha is, did people go home and change their lives? I think that's maybe a good test for a commercial on the Super Bowl at halftime. Did they go out and buy the product? Terrible yardstick of a sermon. But for a rabbi in a pulpit is transmitting fundamental concepts and an ethos by a process almost as slow as osmosis. There shouldn't be one sermon which says your message. There should be, several thousand iterations of your basic principles, of your vision, and the kids who grow up listening to you absorb it. They don't just get it with a single injection.